the summer of 2002, a CIA station chief named Gerald Harmon sat in a secure briefing room in Langley, Virginia. He was 53 years old. He had 26 years of agency experience. He had run operations in Lebanon, Somalia, and the Balkans, and he had just been told that British intelligence officers would be embedded alongside his teams for the upcoming invasion of Iraq. His response was immediate. It was blunt. It was recorded by at least 2 people present in that room. "Get those British lunatics out of here." He said it without hesitation. He said it with the full weight of a man who believed he understood the Middle East better than anyone wearing a Union Jack. He said it because, in his professional estimation, British intelligence operators were reckless cowboys who talked too much, trusted local sources too freely, and operated with an arrogance that bore no relationship to their actual capabilities. He had worked alongside MI6 officers in Beirut in the 1980s. He found them theatrical. He had crossed paths with SAS liaison teams in Bosnia. He found them aggressive to the point of stupidity. He believed, with the unshakable confidence of a man who had never been seriously proven wrong, that British involvement in what was about to become the largest American intelligence operation since the Cold War would be a liability. Gerald Harmon was about to have the worst professional decade of his life. What happened over the next 3 years in southern Iraq would not merely prove Harmon wrong. It would expose a fundamental gap between the CIA's approach to human intelligence in hostile territory and the British method that had been refined across 5 decades of imperial collapse, counterinsurgency warfare, and dirty wars in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. The British didn't just contribute to Iraq. They ran circles around the agency in Basra, in Amara, in Nasiriyah, and across the Shatt al-Arab waterway. They recruited sources the CIA couldn't reach. They predicted attacks the agency missed entirely. They built networks that survived the catastrophic collapse of the occupation's first year. And they did it with a fraction of the budget, a fraction of the personnel, and a level of cultural fluency that left American operatives asking, quietly, reluctantly, and with considerable professional embarrassment, how? It is a story told in specific operations, specific dates, and specific outcomes. It is a story the CIA would prefer you never heard. To understand what happened in Iraq, you first need to understand what the British brought to the table, and why the Americans didn't want it there. The CIA's Iraq Operations Group stood up formally in late 2001 and expanded massively through 2002, was built on a specific model. That model was money. The agency's approach to human intelligence in Iraq relied overwhelmingly on cash payments to recruited agents. Satellite-enabled communication systems costing upwards of $45,000 per unit, and a network of Iraqi exile groups, most prominently Ahmed Chalabi's Iraqi National Congress, who had been receiving CIA funding since the mid-1990s. Between 1992 and 2003, the agency funneled an estimated $100 million to Iraqi opposition groups. Chalabi's organization alone received roughly $33 million in direct payments. The CIA believed that when the invasion came, these networks would deliver actionable intelligence on weapons of mass destruction sites, regime command structures, and the location of senior Ba'athist officials. The British took a fundamentally different approach. MI6's Iraq section, known internally as the Controllerate for the Middle East, had maintained a quieter, smaller, and far more skeptical presence in Iraqi affairs since the end of the Gulf War in 1991. Where the CIA threw money at exile politicians in London and Washington, MI6 ran a handful of carefully cultivated agents inside Iraq itself. The difference was not merely philosophical, it was operational. The CIA's exile networks produced intelligence that was, in the assessment of the Butler Review published in July 2004, seriously flawed and in several cases fabricated. MI6's internal sources, while fewer in number, produced reporting that was rated significantly more reliable by the Joint Intelligence Committee in London. One MI6 source, designated by the cryptonym MRIT, a codename that delighted the British and baffled the Americans, had been providing accurate reporting on Iraqi military dispositions since 1998. A single MI6 officer running Marmite from a base in Jordan produced more actionable tactical intelligence on Iraqi Republican Guard movements in the 6 months before the invasion than the CIA's entire $100 million Exile program. Gerald Harmon didn't know about Marmite. He didn't know about most of what MI6 was running. That was the point, and that was the problem. The British contingent that deployed to Iraq in early 2003 was not a token presence. It was a carefully assembled force of intelligence professionals drawn from MI6, the Defense Intelligence Staff, the Intelligence Corps, and, critically, the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, a unit so secret that the British government did not officially acknowledge its existence until 2006. The SRR had evolved from a unit called 14 Intelligence Company, which had spent 3 decades running covert surveillance operations in Northern Ireland against the Provisional IRA. These were not desk officers. These were men and women who had spent years living undercover in the most hostile urban surveillance environment in Western Europe, running agents in communities where a single mistake meant death, and operating technical surveillance equipment in conditions that would make most CIA field officers physically ill with anxiety. The SRR personnel who arrived in Basra in April 2003 brought with them a skill set that the Americans simply did not possess. They could operate in plain clothes in urban environments for extended periods without detection. They had spent years perfecting the art of the walk past, a surveillance technique developed in Belfast that allowed an operative to assess a target building, identify armed occupants, and map entry and exit points in a single casual pass, lasting no more than 90 seconds. They could recruit and run agents in deeply hostile communities because they had done exactly that in West Belfast and South Armagh, environments where informers were tortured and killed with industrial regularity. They understood tribal and clan-based loyalty structures because Northern Ireland's sectarian geography had taught them that intelligence is always, ultimately, about families. The CIA officers in Basra had none of this. Most had never served in a conflict zone. Several spoke no Arabic whatsoever. Their training at Camp Peary, colloquially known as the Farm, emphasized tradecraft for recruiting diplomats and government officials in stable countries, not running sources in a city, descending into militia chaos. When the first CIA team arrived in Basra in May 2003, they set up in a fortified compound, communicated with potential agents primarily through intermediaries, and relied heavily on signals intelligence piped down from the National Security Agency's regional collection platforms. They operated, in the memorable assessment of one British officer who worked alongside them, like men trying to understand a bar fight by reading the CCTV footage from next door. "Get those British lunatics out of here." The words must have echoed in Gerald Harmon's memory when the first intelligence assessments from Basra started arriving at Langley in June 2003. The British had been on the ground for barely 8 weeks. In that time, a combined MI6 and SRR team operating under the codename Operation Christian, the overarching British Special Forces intelligence operation in Iraq, had achieved something the CIA's southern Iraq station had failed to accomplish in months of pre-war preparation. They had recruited 11 separate sources within the emerging Shia militia networks that were rapidly filling the power vacuum left by Saddam Hussein's collapse. 11 sources. In 8 weeks. The CIA's Basra station, with 3 times the budget and twice the personnel, had recruited 2. One of those 2 was later discovered to be a fabricator who had been feeding the agency invented intelligence about weapons caches that didn't exist. The British method was deceptively simple, and it drove the Americans insane. MI6 officers and SRR operators went out. They walked the streets. They sat in tea houses. They attended tribal meetings, learned names, family connections, grievances, and ambitions. They did this not from behind blast walls and armored vehicles, but on foot, in civilian clothes, sometimes with nothing more than a concealed Browning L9A1 pistol and a communications device the size of a pack of cigarettes. One MI6 officer, known in published accounts only by his operational pseudonym, David, reportedly spent 14 consecutive days living in a rented room above a mechanic's shop in the Hayaniya district of Basra, one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city. He ate local food. He prayed at a local mosque. He built a relationship with a mid-ranking member of the Mahdi army, the Shia militia loyal to Muqtada al-Sadr, that would eventually produce intelligence credited with preventing at least 3 major attacks on British forces. The CIA regarded this as insanity, and they said so. A classified CIA cable from July 2003, portions of which were later disclosed during parliamentary evidence sessions and referenced in the 2009 Iraq inquiry testimony, described British intelligence methods in Basra as unacceptably high risk and inconsistent with established agency protocols for source handling in denied areas. The cable recommended that British officers be excluded from joint intelligence sharing arrangements unless they agreed to adopt American operational security standards. The British response, delivered through MI6's liaison office at the British Embassy in Washington, was polite, it was brief, and it was devastating. We note the agency's concerns. We also note that our methods are producing intelligence. We respectfully suggest that the agency's concerns would carry more weight if the same could be said of theirs. That exchange, dry, surgical, and absolutely lethal, captured the dynamic that would define British-American intelligence relations in Iraq for the next 3 years. The gap between British and American performance in southern Iraq became impossible to ignore during the summer and autumn of 2003, when the security situation in Basra and the surrounding provinces deteriorated with terrifying speed. Iranian-backed militias, primarily Jaish al-Mahdi and the Badr organization, began a systematic campaign to infiltrate the Iraqi police, assassinate secular politicians, and establish shadow governance structures across the Shia south. The CIA, operating from its fortified compound in Basra's former presidential palace, detected almost none of this in real time. Their signals intelligence feeds told them about communications between militia leaders, but couldn't explain the context, the relationships, or the decision-making processes behind those communications. They knew that people were talking. They didn't know what the conversations meant. The British knew. And they knew because they were inside. In September 2003, an SRR surveillance team, operating in Amara, a city of roughly 340,000 people approximately 200 kilometers north of Basra, identified a network of Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force officers who were smuggling a specific type of weapon across the border. The weapon was the Explosively Formed Penetrator, or EFP, a shaped charge capable of punching through the armor of any vehicle in the coalition inventory, including the American M1 Abrams tank. Each EFP contained a copper or tantalum liner machined to precise specifications that could only be met by state-level manufacturing facilities. The SRR team tracked the smuggling route over 11 days, mapping the network from the Iranian border crossing at Shalamcheh through a series of safe houses in Amara to a distribution hub in a disused date processing factory 14 kilometers south of the city center. They identified 19 individuals involved in the network, photographed 16 of them, and traced the financing back to a specific Quds Force unit designated by Iranian military intelligence as Unit 1000. The intelligence was shared with the CIA through established liaison channels. The agency's response was skepticism. A senior CIA analyst at Langley questioned the reliability of the sourcing, noting that the British assessment was based primarily on human intelligence rather than the signals and imagery intelligence the agency preferred. The analyst's memo, referenced in later congressional testimony, stated that the British assessment of Iranian EFP smuggling networks in southern Iraq, while detailed, relies on human sources whose reliability has not been independently verified through technical collection means. 3 months later, in December 2003, an EFP struck a British Army Land Rover near Amara, killing 1 soldier and seriously wounding 2 others. The device matched the exact specifications described in the SRR's September intelligence report. The copper liner bore manufacturing marks consistent with production at the facility the British had identified. The attack was carried out by a cell that included 4 of the 19 individuals the SRR had named. Get those British lunatics out of here. The irony was becoming unbearable. By early 2004, the British intelligence operation in southern Iraq had evolved into something the CIA had never encountered from an allied service. A rival. Not a hostile rival, but a professional competitor whose methods were producing results that made the agency's own performance look increasingly inadequate. The MI6 station in Basra, operating from a nondescript building near the old port district, with a staff of fewer than 20 officers, was generating more finished intelligence reports per officer per month than any CIA station in the country. This was not a British boast. It was an American assessment, produced by the CIA's own Inspector General in a classified review of Iraq intelligence operations, conducted in mid-2004. The review, portions of which were later declassified, found that Allied services operating in MNDSE, Multinational Division Southeast, the British area of operations, demonstrated a markedly higher rate of intelligence production per deployed officer than comparable agency elements. The numbers were stark. In the first quarter of 2004, the MI6 Basra station, 17 officers, produced 214 intelligence reports rated as reliable or highly reliable by the Defense Intelligence Staff in London. The CIA's Southern Iraq station, 43 officers supported by an additional 12 contractors, produced 89 reports over the same period, of which fewer than 60 were rated as reliable by the agency's own Directorate of Intelligence. Per officer, the British were outproducing the Americans by a ratio of roughly 4-1. The reasons were systemic, not individual. American CIA officers in Iraq were generally brave, capable, and genuinely committed to the mission. The problem was institutional. The agency's risk aversion culture, which had deepened significantly after the intelligence failures surrounding the September 11th attacks and the weapons of mass destruction debacle, made it extraordinarily difficult for field officers to operate in the aggressive, high-risk manner that southern Iraq demanded. Every potential source recruitment required approval through multiple layers of bureaucracy. Every operational meeting outside the wire required a security assessment, a communications plan, and a quick reaction force on standby. Every piece of intelligence had to be cross-referenced against signals collection before it could be reported up the chain. The process was thorough. It was also paralyzingly slow. By the time the CIA approved an operation, the intelligence was frequently out of date. The militia had moved. The weapons cache had been relocated. The window had closed. The British had no such constraints. MI6 officers in Basra operated under a system known as devolved authority, which gave individual station officers extraordinary latitude to recruit sources, conduct meetings, and report intelligence without seeking approval from London for each individual operation. The SRR teams embedded with them operated under similarly flexible rules of engagement. The assumption underlying the British system was simple and brutal. The people on the ground knew more than the people in London, and the people in London needed to trust them or replace them. An MI6 officer who identified a potential source on Monday could be meeting that source in a tea house on Tuesday. A CIA officer who identified the same potential source would still be filling out paperwork on Friday. This institutional difference produced a cascading advantage that compounded over time. Because the British recruited sources faster, they built networks faster. Because they built networks faster, they understood the local environment faster. Because they understood the local environment faster, they could anticipate threats faster. And because they could anticipate threats faster, their forces suffered proportionally fewer casualties from militia attacks than American forces operating in comparable environments. In 2004, British forces in southern Iraq suffered 22 fatalities in an area of operations containing approximately 4.5 million people. American forces operating in Baghdad, a city of roughly 7 million, suffered 469 fatalities. Adjusted for population, the British casualty rate was approximately 1/3 of the American rate. Intelligence was not the only factor in that disparity, but multiple post-operational analyses identified British intelligence superiority as a significant contributor. The single most devastating demonstration of the gap between British and American intelligence in Iraq came in the summer of 2004, during a period of intense militia activity across the Shia South. In July of that year, an MI6 agent embedded within the Basra provincial government, a mid-level civil servant who had been recruited 18 months earlier by the officer, known as David, provided a piece of intelligence that would reshape coalition strategy in southern Iraq. The agent reported that the Badr organization the armed wing of the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, had successfully infiltrated the Basra police service to such an extent that the organization now effectively controlled 3 of the city's 4 police districts. The agent provided names, ranks, and dates of recruitment for 37 police officers who were simultaneously serving as Basra operatives. He provided details of weapons stored in police stations. He provided transcripts of meetings between Badr commanders and senior police officials, at which the assassination of specific British allied tribal leaders had been discussed and approved. This intelligence was, by any measure, extraordinary. It revealed that the coalition's entire strategy in southern Iraq, which depended on building up Iraqi security forces as a prerequisite for eventual withdrawal, was fundamentally compromised. The police force that the British and Americans were training, equipping, and paying was simultaneously serving as the armed wing of an Iranian-backed militia. The British shared this intelligence with the CIA immediately. The agency's response was, again, skepticism. A CIA analyst at the agency's Iraq Mission Center questioned whether a single source could be trusted with such sweeping claims. The analyst noted that the British assessment was inconsistent with the agency's own evaluation of Iraqi police service loyalty in Basra province, which had rated the police force as broadly reliable as recently as March 2004. Within 6 months, the British assessment was proven correct in spectacular fashion. In September 2005, 2 SRR operators conducting covert surveillance in Basra were detained by Iraqi police officers who were, precisely as the MI6 source had reported, working for the Mahdi army. The operators were taken to a police station in the Jumayyat district and handed over to militia members who arrived in civilian vehicles. When negotiations for their release failed, British forces mounted a dramatic rescue operation, sending warrior armored vehicles through the walls of the police station. The incident made international headlines and provoked a diplomatic crisis between Britain and Iraq. But it also proved, beyond any reasonable dispute, that the Basra police were compromised exactly as MI6 had reported more than a year earlier. The CIA's own retrospective assessment, produced in early 2006 and referenced in Congressional Intelligence Committee hearings, acknowledged that the British assessment of Basra police infiltration, initially regarded by the agency as overstated, proved substantially accurate and should have been incorporated into coalition planning at an earlier stage. Get those British lunatics out of here. By 2005, nobody at the CIA was saying that anymore, at least not with a straight face. The British intelligence success in Iraq was not limited to human source operations. It extended into a domain that the Americans considered their exclusive preserve: technical surveillance and signals intelligence. The NSA, with its multi-billion-dollar collection infrastructure, dominated the coalition's signals intelligence effort in Iraq. But in southern Iraq, the British demonstrated that smaller, more agile technical capabilities could outperform massive systems in specific operational contexts. The key British capability was a system known within the intelligence community by the codename Stargate. This was not the NSA's program of the same name. British Stargate was a tactical signals intelligence platform developed by GCHQ, Government Communications Headquarters, Britain's signals agency, specifically for urban environments in Iraq. The system was designed to intercept, geolocate, and analyze mobile phone communications within a radius of approximately 4 kilometers. It could be operated by a 2-person team from the back of a civilian vehicle. It could be deployed in under 15 minutes. And it could process intercepted communications in near real time using automated Arabic language analysis software that GCHQ had developed in-house at a cost of roughly £8 million. The NSA's equivalent capability in Iraq required a fixed installation, a team of 12 to 18 analysts, and a processing pipeline that introduced a delay of between 4 and 24 hours between interception and analysis. The NSA system was vastly more powerful in terms of volume. It could intercept tens of thousands of communications simultaneously across the entire country first. But in the narrow, fast-moving world of tactical intelligence in Basra, where a militia leader might use a phone for 30 minutes before discarding it, the British system's speed and mobility gave it a decisive advantage. Between March 2004 and December 2005, Stargate-derived intelligence was credited with enabling the interdiction of 23 weapons shipments, the disruption of 14 planned attacks on British forces, and the identification of over 200 militia operatives in Basra and the surrounding area. A single GCHQ team of 7 analysts operating in Basra produced more actionable tactical signals intelligence over that period than the NSA's entire southern Iraq collection effort. The Americans were not happy about this. They were not happy because it challenged their foundational assumption about intelligence, that capability is a function of scale, and that bigger, more expensive, more technologically advanced systems will always outperform smaller ones. The British were proving, in real time and in measurable outcomes, that this assumption was wrong. Not wrong in theory, wrong in practice. Wrong in the specific quantifiable terms that intelligence professionals cannot argue with. Sources recruited, attacks prevented, networks mapped, lives saved. The cultural dimension of the British advantage deserves particular examination, because it was arguably the most significant factor in the overall intelligence disparity, and the one the CIA found hardest to replicate. British intelligence officers in Iraq benefited from something that no amount of money or technology could buy, an institutional memory of operating in the Middle East that stretched back over a century. MI6's presence in Iraq was not new. British intelligence had maintained a continuous interest in Iraqi affairs since the creation of the modern Iraqi state in 1920, a state that Britain itself had designed, carved out of the Ottoman Empire's Mesopotamian provinces and governed under a League of Nations mandate until 1932. British intelligence officers had been running agents in Baghdad, Basra, and Mosul since before the CIA existed. They understood the tribal structures of southern Iraq, the Bani Malik, the Albu Muhammad, the Bani Tamim, not as abstractions from an analyst's briefing paper, but as living social systems they had been navigating for generations. An MI6 officer arriving in Basra in 2003 could draw on files, contacts, and institutional knowledge accumulated over 83 years of continuous engagement with the region. The CIA's institutional memory of Iraq, by contrast, began essentially in 1991. The agency had maintained a nominal presence in Baghdad during the Cold War, primarily focused on the Soviet-Iraqi relationship, but had no significant human intelligence network inside Iraq before the Gulf War. After 1991, the agency's Iraq effort was dominated by exile politics, covert action programs that repeatedly failed, and an increasingly desperate search for evidence of weapons of mass destruction that would justify the policy decisions already being made in Washington. The CIA arrived in Iraq in 2003 with billions of dollars, thousands of personnel, and the most advanced technical collection systems on Earth. It arrived without the one thing that actually mattered in southern Iraq: relationships. The British had relationships. They had been building them since before Gerald Harmon was born. The consequences of this disparity extended far beyond intelligence collection. They shaped military operations, political outcomes, and ultimately the trajectory of the entire southern Iraq campaign. When British commanders in Basra needed to negotiate with tribal leaders, they sent MI6 officers who could reference shared history, specific events, specific grievances, stretching back decades. When American commanders in Baghdad needed to negotiate with the same tribal networks, they sent CIA officers carrying briefcases full of cash. One approach built trust, the other bought compliance. Trust lasted, compliance didn't. The most telling example came in November 2004, when British forces needed to secure the cooperation of the Albu Muhammad Tribal Confederation for a major operation against militia weapons caches along the Shat al-Arab waterway. The Albu Muhammad were the dominant tribal group in the marshlands east of Basra, a community of roughly 100,000 people who controlled territory that was critical to the Iranian EFP smuggling routes. Their cooperation was essential. Their hostility would have been catastrophic. An MI6 officer, not David, a different officer identified in published accounts as James, arranged a meeting with the paramount sheikh of the Albu Muhammad at a location in the marshes accessible only by boat. He went alone. He carried no weapons. He brought gifts, British tea, specifically, a brand the sheikh's father had reportedly favored when dealing with British political officers in the 1950s. The meeting lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, The Sheikh agreed to provide guides, intelligence on militia movements, and safe passage for British forces through Abu Muhammad territory. In exchange, the British agreed to provide medical supplies to 3 marsh communities and to intervene with the Iraqi government on a water rights dispute that had been ongoing since 1993. The operation that followed, conducted over 9 days in late November 2004, resulted in the seizure of 47 EFPs, over 300 mortar rounds, 12 rocket-propelled grenade launchers, and an estimated 15,000 rounds of ammunition. 3 Quds Force operatives were captured. Number British casualties were sustained. Number Abu Muhammad civilians were harmed. The operation was rated by Multinational Force Iraq headquarters as the single most successful weapons interdiction operation in southern Iraq to that date. The CIA attempted a similar approach with a different tribal group in the same area 3 months later. They offered the tribal leader $50,000 in cash for cooperation. He took the money. He provided no useful intelligence. 2 of the guides he supplied led an American patrol into an ambush that wounded 3 soldiers. The tribal leader was later discovered to be simultaneously receiving payments from the Badr organization. Money buys information, relationships buy loyalty. The British understood the difference. By 2006, the dynamic between British and American intelligence in Iraq had shifted fundamentally. The dismissal, the skepticism, the patronizing cables questioning British methods, all of it had been replaced by something far more uncomfortable for the CIA: dependence. American commanders operating in multinational Division Southeast routinely relied on British intelligence assessments as their primary source of information on militia activity, Iranian interference, and tribal politics. The CIA's Southern Iraq station, which had been expanded to over 60 officers by 2005, was producing fewer actionable intelligence reports than the MI6 station that had never exceeded 23 officers. The CIA's Inspector General report of 2006, portions of which were referenced in the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence's review of Iraq operations, contained a passage that would have made Gerald Harmon physically ill. In the southern Iraq theater of operations, the report stated, Allied intelligence services demonstrated a consistent capability to collect, analyze, and disseminate actionable intelligence at a rate and quality that the agency's own elements were unable to match. This disparity was particularly pronounced in the areas of human source recruitment, tactical signals intelligence, and cultural analysis. There it was, in the CIA's own words, written by the CIA's own Inspector General. The British weren't just good, they were better, and the agency knew it. Gerald Harmon retired from the CIA in 2007. He left quietly, no ceremony, no public statement. He settled in Arlington, Virginia, and spent the next several years consulting for defense contractors, none of whom worked in Iraq. In 2011, at a private dinner hosted by a Washington think tank, Harmon was asked by a former colleague about his assessment of British intelligence in Iraq. His response, reported by 2 attendees, was characteristically blunt. "I was wrong," he said. "They weren't lunatics. They were the only ones who knew what the hell they were doing." It was, perhaps, the most honest thing he ever said about Iraq, and it was 4 years too late to matter. The lessons of British intelligence in Iraq extend far beyond the specific operations, the specific numbers, and the specific institutional failures of the CIA. They speak to a fundamental truth about intelligence work that no amount of technology, no budget allocation, and no bureaucratic reorganization can change. Intelligence is a human enterprise. It depends on human relationships, human judgment, and human courage. The British succeeded in Iraq not because they were braver than the Americans, though the SRR operators who lived among the population of Basra demonstrated a form of courage that defies casual description, but because their institutions were designed, through decades of hard experience, to trust the people they sent into the field. MI6 trusted its officers. The CIA trusted its systems. In the chaos of southern Iraq, where systems failed daily and relationships were the only currency that held its value, that distinction was the difference between intelligence and ignorance. The CIA spent approximately $4.4 billion on intelligence operations in Iraq between 2003 and 2009. MI6's Iraq budget over the same period was estimated at roughly £280 million, approximately $440 million at contemporary exchange rates. The British spent 1/10 of the American budget and produced, by the CIA's own assessment, superior intelligence in the theatre where it mattered most. £440 million against $4.4 billion. 17 officers against 43. 11 sources in 8 weeks against 2. 214 reliable reports against fewer than 60. The numbers told the story. They always do. Somewhere in Arlington, Virginia, an old CIA man once sat with a glass of scotch and thought about a sentence he'd said in a briefing room at Langley when the world was simpler and American supremacy in every field of national security was an article of faith. He'd told them to get the British lunatics out of the room. The British lunatics stayed. They did their jobs. They outperformed the most powerful intelligence agency in the history of civilization. And they did it with tea, shoe leather, and 83 years of knowing every family in the marshes by name.